Embers on the map, prologue to a fracture. Atmosphere, the capital hums like a sealed hive, the first crack is inaudible, but everything already leans toward it. According to our sources embedded in municipal crisis units, the first shots were not fired where anyone expected gunfire. There were no barricades, no stormed ministries, no thunder of armored columns at dawn. The spark began in the soft places, in a municipal archive where the lights remained on too long, in a logistics hub where routes were rerouted without explanation, in a university courtyard where someone spoke just a breath too openly and 100 phones recorded the silence that followed. The Federation had trained its people to expect crises from above, and yet this one arrived like a rumor with steel teeth. In expert circles they discuss a simple, unsettling sentence: the protest did not turn into a war, the war had learned to dress like a protest. Interlocutors cautiously note that the calendar will mislead anyone who tries to plot this beginning onto a single day. The situation remains tense not because an event happened, but because a threshold was crossed and no one can agree when. The morning after the first citywide march, the squares were clean and the news was almost gentle. The footage showed bright flags and careful smiles, the narration spoke of civic enthusiasm, and the drone shots painted a country that still believed it was merely negotiating with itself. But in closed analytical briefings it becomes clear, the choreography of dissent had ceased to be conversation and become logistics. Supply vans bore slogans instead of cargo manifests, courier networks carried leaflets, codes, and rumors, watchwords traveled across districts like rain, heavy, then lighter, then heavy again. Somewhere between the second and the third demonstration, the streets discovered they could relocate meaning from speech to movement. And that is where the script shifted. The first casualties were not bodies, they were deadlines. Hearings postponed, budgets reclassified, tenders redacted into abstractions. The capital, once a clockwork of predictable bureaucratic tempo, learned that time can be weaponized. The Federation's planners, trained to model flows of trucks and energy, struggled to model the viscosity of hesitation. City buses began arriving just late enough to empty the squares of commuters and fill them with people who had time to stand still. Street lamps flickered in a pattern that nobody could prove existed, but everyone could feel. A day in the metropolis began to taste like waiting. And waiting, multiplied across millions of bodies, becomes pressure. From closed rooms where the walls are lined with screens and the air tastes of recycled certainty, a doctrine emerged that was never announced and yet was obeyed: de-intensify without de-escalating. Moderators on state channels softened their tones. Municipal spokespeople replaced warnings with reassurances. Permits for marches were granted along routes that would exhaust without inflaming, and gates that usually slammed shut were left ajar just enough to be a choice. The Federation, aware that it could not forbid the pulse without bursting the artery, decided to guide the rhythm instead. But this careful curation had a flaw: it assumed that movement could be shepherded like a theory. People are not equations, and theories don't bleed. Witnesses describe a strange choreography in the second week, protest columns dissolving and reconvening miles away, as if the city itself had learned to multiply footsteps. The slogans changed timbre. Where once they were declarative, now they were interrogative. What do you owe a system that no longer recognizes your breathing? Who is sovereign when the price of bread is calculated by those who do not eat it? These questions, whispered in underpasses and lifted into the open air, transformed what the Federation classified as civil agitation into something without a comfortable name. Not an uprising, not yet a war, an atmosphere that makes all outcomes plausible. According to civil-military liaisons who still believe in the old vocabulary, the first kinetic breach was exquisitely banal. A junction box burned out near an industrial estate. A service road was blocked by unforeseen maintenance. The fire brigade arrived too quickly and left too slowly. In the hour that followed, a convoy carrying spare components for a power substation took a detour that placed it within sight of a march that had not been approved but had been expected. The drivers braked. The crowd parted, then closed. Hands reached out, not to strike, but to hold. For a long minute that nobody now can measure, the Federation and its children stood immobile, touching in a way that felt like an accusation and a plea in equal measure. When the convoy finally moved on, it was missing one pallet. That pallet, later, would become a symbol. The first theft or the first requisition, it depends who writes the textbooks. From internal analyses we have reviewed through secondary channels, the planners of stability committed a basic error: they forgot that supply chains are moral structures as much as they are logistical ones. If you teach a city that routes are arteries, do not be surprised when citizens learn surgical metaphors. In 3 districts, deliveries were diverted from municipal depots to ad hoc kitchens that fed the marches. No one authorized this. No one resisted it. A principle had shifted. Ownership of necessity moved from ledger to street. And once necessity relocates, the monopoly on meaning cracks. The Federation's communication strategy adapted, as it always does, with dangerous fluency. Anchors stopped using the word protest and replaced it with concentration of citizens. They spoke of micro-disruptions where people reported windows shaking. They offered a promise that sounded like absolution: every voice will be heard. But the content of this hearing changed overnight. A portal appeared, clean fonts, gentle colors, a reassurance disguised as an invitation: tell us your concerns. In expert circles they discuss what followed as the most elegant misdirection of the season. Instead of listening, the Federation measured complaint as compliance, participation as map. People wrote their sorrows into a database that learned to map pain to the centimeter. Networks that once coordinated pizza orders and study groups began receiving invisible throttling at times that coincided with rallies. The algorithm, polite to the point of cruelty, optimized outrage until it fit within an evening broadcast. All this would have remained the theater of power and counterpower, had it not been for one night when the weather conspired with memory. Rain fell in a pattern that made the city's soundscape unfamiliar, sirens softened, chants became percussion, the river swallowed reflections until the bridges looked like cuts in the sky. The march that night was small, almost ceremonial. Yet somewhere near the river bend, a cordon changed shape and the shape failed to hold. Not a charge, not a retreat, something in between, like a muscle choosing to spasm rather than tear. A bottle flew and shattered, a shield rose and lowered. In the 5 seconds that followed, language ceased to be useful. When words returned, someone had fallen. The Federation called it an accident. The streets called it a beginning. Psychologists embedded in relief networks reported a phenomena they had seen in natural disasters: the shift from empathy to mobilization without passing through reflection. People who would have lit candles 2 months earlier began collecting supply lists. The insistence on nonviolence evolved into a willingness to protect. Barricades grew at the edges of neighborhoods, not imposing, but tactical. Not to keep the authorities out, but to keep fear from coming in. And in this geometry of defense, a new cadre arrived: people who had never spoken into megaphones, who had never written petitions, who had spent their lives in the thin air of unrecorded competence. Engineers, nurses, mechanics, coders. They arrived not with slogans, but with workflows. The protest learned to breathe through systems. That breath, once steady, can power a very different machine. Interlocutors from within the Federation's security circles whisper that what frightened leadership was not the numbers, not the slogans, not even the barricades. It was the maps. They saw, on their screens, clusters that should not have existed, corridors of safe passage opening where there should have been friction, patients accumulating in districts previously marked as volatile. The city was not preparing to burn. It was learning to endure. And endurance, productive and polite, is the worst enemy of force. From closed analytical reports it becomes clear that a decision point arrived concealed as a procedural memo. Redesignate the protests as a security event, activate contingency planning under the statute for distributed hazards. The word hazard allowed for a shift in how rules applied. The Federation could now deploy units not in response to people, but in response to risks modeled as shapes and colors on a monitor. Streets became gradients, citizens became vectors. It is a short, almost invisible step from modeling risk to preempting it. And it is in the space of preemption that wars decide they are inevitable. The first true sign that the narrative had crossed into its own reflection was auditory. Distant thunder that wasn't weather. Controlled bangs described as acoustic deterrents that left a metallic aftertaste on the tongue. Windows breathed inward, the city's involuntary gasp. After that night, the vocabulary of the street turned from we to we must. Kitchens became clinics. Scout groups became medics. The Federation, now speaking the language of stabilization, deployed static units near intersections and mobile ones behind unmarked glass. The two sides learned each other's rhythms the way animals learn the forest, by listening to what goes quiet before it moves. An old man who had no business being in the front row of anything said to an interviewer, his face veiled by shadow the shape of a doorframe, "This is not a protest anymore. It is the last conversation a family has before someone packs a suitcase. There is love in it, and there is bitterness, and there is a sense of rooms being measured for absence." That sentence traveled further than he did. In the days that followed, a claim took root that no official could counter because it was not a claim about facts. It was a claim about thresholds. People began saying that the Federation had already decided. The street's logic was cruelly clear: if they prepare for war, they will get a war; if they model us as risk, we will become risk. This is not prophecy, the leaders insisted, this is caution. But the software learned faster than the rhetoric. Predicted hotspots received prepositioned deterrents, predicted lulls received a generous allotment of electricity and song. The feedback loop tightened until discretion became indistinguishable from design. The moment the first improvised device detonated under an empty pylon on the outskirts of the port, the Federation announced that a line had been crossed. But lines are agreements disguised as geometry, and the streets had stopped agreeing days before. The device was not crude, it was apologetic. It knocked out no lights, it hurt no one, it spoke in a grammar that said, "Do you hear us now?" And the answer, which arrived with armored windows and tidy phrases about perseverance, was written by a committee that still believed images could govern pain. In expert discussions, an ugly conclusion is forming like frost on glass: the war did not begin when blood fell. It began when permission was redefined. The Federation authorized itself to anticipate, the streets authorized themselves to adapt. Between anticipation and adaptation lies a battlefield that does not need fronts to exist. Supply columns and rumor vectors share the same corridors. Code and cordon mirror each other's precision. The face of a young woman handing out water is more strategically significant than any speech delivered from a balcony. You cannot patient your way out of a decision you have already made. If there is an opportunity left, thin, trembling, briefly visible, it lives in places that cameras despise. In the breath between a command and its execution. In the refusal of a technician to label a dataset with a word that will turn people into targets. In the whisper of a unit commander who tells his squad to hold position 5 minutes longer than the script prescribes. These acts are not heroism. They are a different kind of math. A subtraction of inevitability so small it looks like error. A miscount that saves a neighborhood from becoming a thesis. But momentum is a scholar with no sentimentality. It annotates and advances. And tonight, as the city lowers its eyelids against a sleep it cannot earn, a new map waits to be displayed in a room where oxygen is filtered and laughter is contraband. The map will be convincing. It will show why the Federation must move now, why delay is weakness, why legitimacy lives in speed. On that map, there will be no families, only flows. No voices, only noise. No history, only predictions. If the map wins, the streets will lose their nouns and become verbs that only one grammar can conjugate. People seldom speak these things aloud, not because they lack courage, but because narration itself becomes complicity when the ending is already sketched. Yet silence is not innocence, it is assignment. And if the Federation's experiment is to redefine what citizens are permitted to be, then the only counter-experiment is to refuse the new definitions, even privately, even in the quiet inventory of one's day. There are choices that remain unmodeled: to draw a curtain when a lens expects light, to keep a promise when data predicts defection, to remember names when policy prefers categories. Of such thresholds, official statements will say nothing. They will speak instead of balance, of stability, of a return to normalcy that feels increasingly like an anecdote told to calm a child. The rest will be managed as logistics, policed as weather, optimized as traffic. But those who have read the closed reports, who have watched the city learn its new heartbeat, understand, a war can begin without the ceremony of a declaration. It begins in the moment a society decides that fear is cheaper than trust, and then builds an economy around that discount. If you need to hear this clearly, hear it now. The first shot already sounded. It was fired in a language that doesn't leave holes in walls. And what comes next will be justified in fonts that look like care. Keep your eyes on what is not named. Keep an ear for the pauses, not the speeches. And if you want to follow the thread others will pretend is not there, do not pass by. Stay with it, stay attentive, and subscribe to what is often unsaid, because the unsaid is where the map is being redrawn. According to our sources who still walk the corridors where decisions are formatted into sentences, the Federation has entered the quietest phase of conflict, the phase where both sides pretend they are not at war with their own reflection. Streets are open, schedules are published, broadcasts laugh on cue, and yet the pulse never returns to innocence. In expert circles they discuss this condition with the caution of doctors describing an incurable but livable diagnosis, a stable turbulence, a domesticated emergency. The documents avoid words that anchor blame. They prefer gradients and curves, relief and recalibration, those careful terms that convert history into a maintenance log. But beneath the taxonomies, the pattern holds, permission defines reality, and the margins where permission thins are where the story writes itself in a sharper hand. Interlocutors cautiously note that the final transformation was not legislative, not even operational. It was cognitive. The Federation has learned to narrate harm as hygiene, and the public has learned to accept hygiene as a ritual of belonging. Every checkpoint now apologizes, every delay says thank you for your patience, every denial comes wrapped in the promise that it prevents a greater denial. This is the perfected theater of governance through care, an optimization of feeling that leaves no fingerprints, only etiquette. The protest, once the language of refusal, has been archived as a dialect of loyalty, and the early nights of shouting now appear in retrospective compilations with soft music and commemorative fonts. Such tenderness is not compassion. It is compression. From closed comparative analyses that never reach daylight, a bleak insight emerges. The Federation's most durable innovation was not the management of scarcity, nor the choreography of return. It was the invention of a calendar with no edges. There are no beginnings to mark with alarm and no endings to demand relief. Instead, micro-episodes gently overlap, brief outages called maintenance, short deployments called demonstrations of presence, narrow corridors of speech called civic engagement. Inside this quilt of minor adjustments, the citizen learns to accept a life of parentheses. What is said sits in brackets, what is done lives between footnotes. You wake up inside an explanatory note and fall asleep inside a redaction. Psychologists embedded in community centers describe a stubborn residue even in districts that appear calm. They call it anticipatory obedience, the tendency to preempt punishment by shrinking one's radius of life. It arrives as prudence and settles as personality. People keep their tanks half full, their plans half formed, their sentences half finished. Not because they fear a knock at the door, such knocks are too dramatic for a system that prefers metrics to metaphors, but because they fear misalignment, those invisible moments when one's personal tempo gets ahead of the public rhythm. The Federation, through nothing more explosive than scheduling and tone, has installed a metronome in the spine. And yet, there is a parallel archive that refuses to be catalogued. It lives in the shy fidelity of ordinary tasks performed under abnormal ceilings. A train dispatcher who refuses to reroute a medical car to make way for a ceremonial convoy. A statistics clerk who leaves an entry blank rather than invent the number a superior expects. A teacher who assigns a poem that names what is happening without naming it at all. Small, untelevised interferences. In the aggregate, they are not resistance as spectacle. They are resistance as margin of error, enough to preserve a contour of humanity no algorithm knows how to flatten. In expert circles, those who still believe in unquantified dignity call these gestures conservation acts, as though identity were a species facing habitat loss. Security doctrine, updated quietly, has absorbed this undercurrent and rebranded it as a tolerable inefficiency. The manuals speak of ambient variance, a phrase that sounds like weather and functions like permission to ignore the living. If the device at the port's perimeter was apologetic, the new doctrine is economical. It focuses on flows, not feelings, on the reliability of supply, not the integrity of consent. That is why the maps look so clean. They are accurate representations of a decision to outsource conscience to performance indicators. A neighborhood is well if it does not interrupt the blue of transit, the green of commerce, the yellow of sentiment. Any other color is flagged for recoloring. The protesters, those who have not been swallowed by exhaustion or promoted into curated dissent, have evolved into custodians rather than insurgents. Their slogans have softened into sentences that begin with "let us" and end with "so we do not break." They steward kitchens, clinics, data hygiene, de-escalation trainings. They know that spectacle feeds the system and that quiet competence starves it of the adrenaline it needs to justify escalation. This is wisdom, and it is costly. Living without the narcotic of grand gestures requires a discipline that wars seldom reward. But it is the only discipline that refuses to reimburse the Federation with the very drama it is prepared to monetize. If there is a scene that belongs in the final frame of this account, it is not an explosion or a treaty. It is a table, one of those municipal tables that has seen more elbows than signatures, where a child draws a borderless city in gray pencil. The drawing has roads but no checkpoints, schools with windows and no flags, a river with bridges that look like smiles even adults distrust. The parent watches and does not correct. The parent says that's beautiful, and the child believes it. In the taxonomy of impacts, this moment counts for nothing. In the archaeology of futures, it is a shard from which entire vessels can be reconstructed. From the last tranche of internal memos, a final irony surfaces like a cipher that decrypts itself. The Federation has built a system so tightly optimized for predictability that it has reintroduced unpredictability where it least expects it, the private moral calculus of people who have recovered the habit of pausing. Not the pause of fear, but the pause of memory. What we consented to. What we refused. What we will not allow to be measured. In a society of synchronized hesitations, a deliberated pause is an act of sovereignty. It is the smallest republic, and it confers citizenship on anyone who enters it. In expert discussions, they now ask a question that would have sounded naive at the beginning and sounds radical at the end: what if victory is the wrong unit of measurement? Wars defined by fronts and flags can be counted in years and graves. This war of cadence and consent demands softer instruments. The number of days without a punitive example. The width of corridors where people can speak without rehearsing. The distance between an instruction and an internal yes. If these measures widen, the Federation's total design thins. If they narrow, the experiment completes itself. The metrics will not be published. The results will be felt. Interlocutors who have learned to speak in ellipses say the future will be decided in the mundane: procurement meetings, curriculum choices, zoning laws, the spacing of benches in public squares. If benches face each other, a city intends conversation. If they face nothing, a city prefers transit. You cannot make revolution from benches, the cynics say, and they are correct. But you can build a civic nervous system that does not mistake quiet for consent. And perhaps that is the most subversive inheritance the protests bequeath: an allergy to conflating order with agreement. As for the Federation, it will continue to announce seasons of resilience, to schedule its festivals of unity, to press its ear against the glass of sentiment dashboards and listen for the beat it believes it conducts. It will keep the lights at dusk just a little dimmer than necessary, so gratitude can be harvested from relief. It will avoid spectacle unless spectacle turns profitable. It will refine the art of granting what it could not prevent and calling it generosity. The system is not omnipotent. It is simply tireless. Its endurance is procedural, it wins by never needing to rest. So where does this leave those who still carry the ember rather than the slogan? Here, in the stubborn practice of unmeasured care. In the choice to keep one's voice unaligned until it means what it intends. In the labor of rebuilding institutions at the scale of a room, a shift, a route, a paragraph. In the refusal to let memory be domesticated into montage. This is not romantic. It is administrative courage by other means. It will not trend, it will not be televised, it will not be reimbursed. But it will keep intact the part of the social body the Federation cannot occupy, the capacity to distinguish between being managed and being seen. The conclusion, then, is not a line but an atmosphere. The Federation has perfected the science of aftermath, and the citizens have mastered the art of remainder. The conflict persists as an arrangement, not an event. It can be paused, it cannot be resolved by performance. The work ahead is patient and granular, the sort that confuses algorithms and bores tyrants. Attend to it, and the map will slowly forget the lines it never deserved. Ignore it, and the echo will become the only song the city remembers. Of such endings, public channels will offer only the comforting lie, that normal has returned and history has been archived. Trust instead the quiet litany of ordinary defiance whispered in kitchens and doorways, in transit depots and server rooms, where people still choose meaning over metrics. Keep close to those who hear the tempo shift before the announcement, who can tell relief from release. And if you have walked with this story to its last light, take what matters and carry it forward, not alarm, but clarity, not spectacle, but stamina, not the performative courage of noise, but the durable courage of care. Of these things, people rarely speak aloud, so stay with the thread, stay alert to the silences that pretend to be safety, and subscribe to the interval where truth gathers itself for speech, before the loud machinery of certainty drowns it out.